One day after the amendment in the Witkoff proposal, the response finally came from Hamas in relation to the agreement or the draft that Steve Witkoff submitted to reach a ceasefire inside of the Gaza Strip. Hamas, from their perspective, they had consultations with the Palestinian resistance factions. The consultations led to Hamas responding to this proposal coming from Steve Witkoff by saying that they accept it with certain notes. Now, these notes are not very significant. So, in effect, there is a Hamas acceptance. Steve Witkoff, and the fact that Steve Witkoff went and said this is wholly unacceptable from Hamas and takes us back in the negotiations, that's because Steve Witkoff is still more aligned with Israel than he is, of course, with the Palestinians. The American administration is not going to turn to a Palestine lover all of a sudden. That's not going to happen. And of course, Steve Witkoff, he wants things to be more in favor of Israel than they are for the Palestinian side. However, that didn't let Hamas disregard the key things that they want from this ceasefire, which are, there was a translation here in the Palestine Chronicle that I wanted to go through with you. And I'm not going to go through all of the clauses because the clauses are exactly as the ones we spoke about when I spoke about the clauses 2 days ago. We spoke about all of the details to do with the clauses of the ceasefire agreement. You can go ahead and watch that video. Now, the duration is still the same. The release, a slight detail here: 4 living prisoners on day 1, 2 on day 30, and 4 on day 60. So from a Hamas perspective, they want to diversify the dates, but the number is the same. And that's very, very important. As a matter of fact, this is more leniency from Hamas, because Hamas previously said that they will not release anyone unless we're talking about a complete end of the war. Now they're saying, all right, we're willing to release 10 live Israeli prisoners of war, well, IDF terrorists who were held by the Palestinian resistance, but not on the days that Israel wanted, which is the first day. And then the final day, they said, no, in the beginning, we'll release 4, then 2, then another 4 alongside bodies. And we'll talk about the Palestinian prisoners who will be released to. Now, in relation to the other changes that Hamas wanted here, again, most of the things are similar. But one of the things that Hamas wanted more clarification on is the aid and the humanitarian situation. There wasn't a lot of clarification previously in relation to the humanitarian aid. Even with the humanitarian aid that's going now into the Gaza Strip, it doesn't, for example, include any sort of medication, any sanitation products, just things for babies, infants, you know what I mean? They don't have none of that. So from a Hamas perspective, they want a clarification about that, about the electricity, water, everything to do with that. Now, they're saying that the aid needs to go in immediately, and that the humanitarian protocol needs to be the same as the one stipulated in January 19th in that agreement through the United Nations and its agencies. That's something that, by the way, Israel and the United States are now clearly agreeing on, even if they're not really clarifying as much. But Israel even said, there were reports in Israel that Israel would allow the United Nations to be operating, because Israel was against the United Nations very heavily. But now they're seeing the massive failure that's happening from the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. That means more UN and more other charitable organizations that had previous involvement inside of the Gaza Strip. Then from a perspective of the rebuilding, they said they want to continue and begin with the rebuilding process, taking all of the rubble, all of these things from the beginning. Now, they want a declaration of a permanent ceasefire. Hamas. On day 1, indirect negotiations will begin under the sponsorship of mediating guarantors for a permanent ceasefire covering the following topics. And one of them is a declaration of a permanent ceasefire. Now, there is another thing that from an Israeli perspective, that was problematic. An independent technocrat committee that no one is disagreeing on that much will immediately begin managing the affairs of the Gaza Strip upon the start of this agreement's implementation. So Hamas want this technocratic government to start in now, whereas in the other draft, that's not really mentioned clearly, with full powers and responsibilities. This is the clause that drove Israel insane. Cessation of mutual military hostile operations between the two parties for a long period, 5 to 7 years, guaranteed by the mediators, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar. Then they're adding the presidential support and a couple of details to do with the release of the Palestinian prisoners too. Then the guarantees. Steve Witkoff will come to finalize the agreement, and Trump will personally announce the ceasefire agreement. Similar things that we had in the previous draft. So the key differences here are Hamas's persistence on having a long-term ceasefire. We're talking about 5 to 7 years, a confirmation that it's going to be leading to a permanent ceasefire on day one of that agreement being implemented. A slight difference in the dates when they will be releasing the Israeli prisoners of war from the Gaza Strip. So in essence, Hamas are agreeing on everything. It's just that Israel is trying to portray it in a different way, and Steve Witkoff, because he's more aligned to Israel and he wants things to be more in the favor of Israel rather than the Palestinian side, he's saying, oh, that's not acceptable. He previously said that Hamas's response was unacceptable. Yet he doesn't open his mouth when Benjamin Netanyahu has been the person breaking the actual ceasefire that he signed on. Why are we here? Because Israel broke the ceasefire. That's why. Israel breaks ceasefires 24/7. Israel had periods of quiet, and then they'll go and instigate another war and another genocide. And Israel didn't even need the 7th of October to be here, by the way. So, of course, Steve Witkoff in Israel would criticize, but they need to understand very clearly that's an option. Now, Israel is saying that, well, that means we're going to have to go full force. Well, you already announced that you're going full force. You already declared that you have a new operation in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip called the Gideon's Chariots, or Netanyahu's wheelchair, failing miserably now with the Palestinian resistance targeting the genocide forces every single day in Gaza. Today, more images of them targeting the terror forces and more missile launches from the Gaza Strip. Imagine that, just like in the past couple of hours, which shows you that they're failing miserably. And they're resorting to even planting like liquid TNT in certain places, or liquid flammable things to replace some of their bombs so that they can strike them with smaller missiles, so that they don't use their heavy arsenal. Israel and their soldiers, their terrorists, they don't know what they're doing in Gaza. It's all shambles. It's all catastrophic for them. It's diabolical. So from an Israeli perspective, there isn't much that they can threaten the Palestinians with. So what are they going to tell them now? We're going to open the gates of hell again? Well, but the Palestinians have lost everything anyway in Gaza. You can't do anything to the people of Gaza that will be worse than what has happened before. And what's been happening so far, it's not like Israel gave them any sort of respite or any sort of freedoms or things. No, the situation is very bad for the population. And from a military perspective from Israel, well, they're failing miserably. Now, what's worrying Israel more is the change, well, the slight change of tone coming from the United States. Of course, there are disagreements and there are tensions, but now there are reports that Benjamin Netanyahu is actually really upset with Ron Dermer, his main guy, the Minister for Strategic Affairs in Israel and the main man in the United States. In this report here, they're saying Dermer didn't realize he was being worked on. Prime Minister is disappointed with his associate who didn't foresee the changes in the US. And that was the first publication here in one of the Israeli mainstream media outlets. Against the backdrop of differences of opinion regarding the Iranian nuclear program and the American call for an end to the war, Netanyahu criticized the Minister of Strategic Affairs, who was considered his man in the US, for not foreseeing the change in the position towards Israel. Senior government officials said he was certain that they wouldn't go against us, and now, despite the reality, basically showing that the United States is going against Israel. Of course, Benjamin Netanyahu is denying, but we have had many of these instances when Benjamin Netanyahu was criticizing Ron Dermer and people who are next to him. Now, what's worrying them a lot in this report, by the way, what they added is the fact that the right wing, the traditional right wing in the United States, some of them are starting to have more hostile positions against the state of Israel. And what Netanyahu and his crew are calling the woke right now. They like to use this terminology and language to manipulate people. They'll pretend like they're against the woke and then support Zionism. All of that garbage. Anyway, one of the things that's worrying them is the shift in the right wing in the United States. And they're mentioning in this article as well people like Tucker Carlson, for example, who whispers in the ear of Donald Trump. And Netanyahu, well, before he became the prime minister in his current term that he's serving, he was on a massive round in the United States. If you don't remember, he was with people like Jordan Peterson. He was with some of these leaders of the mega churches inside of the United States, meeting with all sorts of people in the right-wing media in the United States to sell himself as the man for the right wing, even in the United States and not just in Israel. And the problem for Benjamin Netanyahu now is that he's seeing a shift. And the bigger problem is the fact that Ron Dermer is delusional with what's happening. According to this report, Ron Dermer wasn't really seeing the change, and he still doesn't believe that there are even any changes with the American administration. But now it's outright reaching a stage where Benjamin Netanyahu is criticizing him directly.